In the landscape of gaming, there really is something special that can be said for a series that has built the foundations of a genre and has sustained all of this staying power for well over 25 years. Resident Evil is an incredible series that has managed to reinvent itself so many times, for better or worse. The first major change in direction that this series would take was with the release of Resident Evil 4, which would lean to a more action horror direction. And this was taken due to the low sales of the remake for Resident Evil 1, which released for the GameCube. Resident Evil's director Shinji Mikami decided that with Resident Evil 4, the series would take a more action-oriented direction, whilst preserving many of the game's tense survival horror aspects. This decision ultimately worked out in Capcom's favour, creating one of the peak horror experiences that I've ever played, and a game that some would argue is the perfect game, blending the perfect mix of action and horror. However, the final product that we have now didn't come easy. Throughout the long 5 years of development, Capcom would see 4 different iterations of what would have been Resident Evil 4, one of which, funnily enough, culminated in Devil May Cry, and another concept surrounding a girl being protected by a dog, which would also eventuate into another game called Hunting Ground, which would release in the same year as Resident Evil 4. There are many concepts and ideas and aspects of the original ideas here that would make it into the final game, and create that lightning in a bottle that is Resident Evil 4. Ultimately, Resident Evil 4 is a masterclass in engaging gameplay that pushes the player to their limits whilst making them feel like they're in control of the situation. So here lies the big question about remaking a game that is beloved by many and is arguably the perfect game. Is a remake necessary? And will it reach the same heights as the original? To answer these questions, we'll start by continuing the track record of Capcom. Basically, after Resident Evil 4's release, the following 2 entries would lean further into the action-based combat, which was laid out by Resident Evil 4, indulging more in quick time events, action set pieces, and bombastic over-the-top action sequences. This would divide many fans, but wouldn't be until the release of Resident Evil 7 in 2017 that the series would return to its more survival horror roots and see a resurgence and demand for that type of game. It was clear to Capcom that with this recent success with Resident Evil 7 that the demand for survival horror had resurfaced, and with many of the older series titles sitting on older consoles and becoming more dated, this was a proper opportunity that Capcom sought to remake and breathe new life into many of these existing classics. And it would start this ripple effect that began with Resident Evil 2, which would sell incredibly well and even be a nominee for Game of the Year. These remakes would still honour their original source material and encapsulate much of the DNA found in the original, whilst brushing up and modernising many of the combat aspects and making the story more cinematic and providing a more serious tone. Some of the changes that can be found in this is the removal of tank controls and fixed camera angles, and going for a more modernised over-the-shoulder approach, which was established funnily enough in Resident Evil 4. So now, apologies for the long intro, but we shift to 2023 and we have the release of Resident Evil 4's remake. And now we're going to get to that answer to that big question: is this remake warranted? And it's more apparent now just given how accessible the original Resident Evil 4 is and how well the original holds up. For me at least, it's a resounding yes. Having played the original and the remake back to back, I think both games are incredible in their own rights and their own merits. And I think that this direction that the Resident Evil 4 remake takes fits and threads so perfectly into what the other remakes are trying to accomplish and the sequels are going for with their narrative direction and gameplay mechanics. I think that the do-away of tank controls and the new brilliant ideas that they have factored into the combat, the trimming down in many different areas of these levels, makes a brilliant game feel even more incredible. And I don't think that Resident Evil 4 is a definitive way to play Resident Evil 4, but I think it's more a masterful reimagining and alternative way to play Resident Evil 4. I think Resident Evil 4 still holds up incredibly well, but the remake is a phenomenal game, and it really does sell this universe that Capcom is trying to mold with its existing and future entries. It doesn't replace the original, but it serves as its own significant entry that is one of the greatest games I feel like I've played, with its replay value and its immersive environments. So let's just dive into why this game is just so phenomenal. Let's get into it.
How's everyone going? Bingo?
We'll kick things off by discussing the story for Resident Evil 4, which remains mostly intact, playing out and telling the same core events that happened in the original, and following our hard-boiled, military-trained Leon Kennedy on a mission to rescue the president's daughter. The game takes place 6 years after the events of the Raccoon City incident. The game does feel like it portrays Leon's character a little differently here to how he was in the original, having him feel like a more grounded and serious character who's kind of angsty at times, in contrast to his more action hero badass character with his one-liners and quips like "your small time" or referring to an enemy as "the big cheese." Whilst I find the original title's campy nature quite charming and endearing, the type of atmosphere and setting that they've been establishing with the remakes and overall direction here is something that can be felt in 4 and I do feel works in the game's favour. The narrative trims and reworks some of the characters and story moments whilst keeping the main events and plot points intact, and to be honest, in a lot of ways enhances and fills in many of the blanks, and places the 4th entry properly into the thematic and overarching narrative that the remakes are threading together. From here on out, I'm going to be diving into some things that I'll consider spoilers, so if you're still working your way through the game or it's your first time playing it, feel free to just jump ahead. I'll leave a timestamp above, and you can come back to this once you finish the game. Anyways, let's get on with the story.
Seemed like you really wanted to talk. How observant, senor. Now, say, you got a smoke? You know, those things will kill you. Oh, well, maybe just untie me then, huh?
One of the major differences that one familiar with RE4 may notice is the tonal shift in storytelling. As I mentioned earlier, Leon's character here is a lot different, but it's not just him. They've taken great lengths to rework many of the conversations and cut out a lot of the back and forth between Leon and Salazar and even Leon and Sattler. One thing that I really do like in this remake is they've given Ashley more character. It feels like she's less like a damsel in this game and more relatable as a character, and the moments between her and Leon really do feel like they flesh out the relationship that these characters share throughout their journey. And whilst I say, and I will say with this review, that there is so many things that I love about the remake, that isn't to imply that there is anything wrong with the original, and I think, in summary, that is what makes this remake so perfect. It is just another way of seeing the game. It polishes many aspects of the game from a narrative standpoint, and sets the theme to work alongside a lot of the previous remakes and recent sequels of the game, but it also lets the original game be its own thing and still lets it stand on its own 2 feet. It doesn't make the remake the only way to experience this. There is 2 great ways to experience Resident Evil 4, and either way you can't really go wrong. Whilst we're on the topic of discussing characters, there are many characters here in the remake that are given a lot more attention, and I think that's great. And a prime example here is Lewis, who gets way more screen time in this version of the game. In the remake, the character Lewis is given a whole character arc that really makes you care for him, beyond the fact that he's just a cool dude. Speaking of characters that got a lot more development, when I played the original and then I played the remake back to back, there was one character that I noticed that they really brushed up on their story and added a few little extra details to, and that was Krauser. They really did touch on his relationship with Leon early in the game and throughout a lot more in depth, and it made those sequences that play out throughout the story a lot more impactful than I would say they were in the original. And I think that they were both going for different things here, but they really did lay out his motives, goals and objectives a lot more clearer in the remake. And I think from a narrative standpoint, that is something that is really great about RE4's remake. There is a lot more clarity with its narrative, and I think it does a superb job of fleshing out a lot of these characters that were great in RE4's original game, and they've just become more heightened in this experience throughout the remake. I think that this can be largely attributed to just how well structured the game is, from all of its narrative beats and where they are laid out, to the level structure and what they've chose to keep and remove from the original game. And that's crazy considering that there never really was a big pacing problem with Resident Evil 4. You could get nitpicky and try and think of things that you could improve with the game, like with anything, but I think Resident Evil 4 originally was a pretty well structured game. And it's crazy to think here with the remake that they've managed to top that and make a game that is paced even better and kind of condensed down to tell the most optimal parts of Resident Evil 4 while not sacrificing or trading off anything from the original's work. As I mentioned earlier, Resident Evil 4 is a departure from its survival horror roots, being more action focused. But that isn't to say that there isn't some great survival horror moments throughout this game. And a prime example of this is the segment where you play as Ashley. This section in the original was heart racing, and in the remake, with the use of lighting and lack thereof in this compact library, it's a claustrophobic nightmare that makes you feel fearful for your life. And from how well the atmosphere is lit and the way the environments are structured and having these giant towering knights come after you, it really is something that breaks up the pace in a great way, and it really is a horror to behold, especially given the fact that you are no longer Leon with your weapons and abilities and you have been stripped of the ability to fight back. It really does change the flow of the game, for the better in my opinion, and it's something that I'm glad they kept from the original. Simply put, my thoughts on the RE4 remake is that it feels like a more succinct version of the original game, but not so foreign or absent of any of the pivotal moments that the original has. There's no retconning or reworking in any of the major beats, but more in its structure, and it delivers a more concise game that tells all the key points and trims down a game that already felt like it was perfectly paced to make it feel like it flows even more seamlessly. It's a narrative that is a perfect alternative to an already charming campaign, and no matter what version of Resident Evil 4 that you pick up and play, you'll be in for a good time. The remake, however, fits perfectly into this current catalogue of the Resident Evil universe that Capcom is trying to build through its remakes and recent ongoing sequels. One major aspect of Resident Evil 4's remake that has been completely reworked from the ground up is the removing of the tank controls and the inclusion of stealth mechanics, shortcut mapping for weapons, and a new parry system that is tied to the way the knife operates in the game. The game functions entirely different from its 2005 counterpart, yet still encapsulates the level of both tension and action throughout. The original RE4 was the first game that really took the game in an action-oriented direction, and that can still be seen and felt in the remake, with a number of weapons, enemy types, and the sheer amount of ammo reserves scattered throughout the game. This new combat model they've built for this game feels so satisfying and comprehensive, from the weapon swapping to the environmental hazards that you can use to lure your enemies and dispose of them. The combat in Resident Evil 4 feels both tense and strategic. Another noticeable change in the remake is the removal of QuickTime events, which would become a regular occurrence throughout the original game and seldom appear in this remake. Instead of the many different forms of QuickTime events, they replace this with a parry system, and whilst there is still some regular button mashing to break free from enemies that have grabbed you, Leon can also deflect attacks of people that are going to attack him. However, these deflections degrade your knife, meaning that you'll need to repair it, meaning you can't abuse this mechanic too much, and we'll touch on how repairs work later. One element of the original game that has seen a return is the iconic tiled suitcase for its inventory management. And in the remake, there's a few additions in both functions that keep the flow of combat and crafting engaging. The first new addition includes gunpowder and resources, which enable Leon to craft ammunition and supplies on the fly. This is a new addition that's seen its way worked into the remakes and has followed suit into the RE4 remake. The second new feature that is helpful throughout your adventures, but can also detract from the original charm of the inventory management side of the game, is an auto sort system. This shuffles and sorts your suitcase, allowing you to fit and store resources more easily. I'm of two minds with this. There are times where I do feel like this is a convenient feature, but at the same time, I think that there's a slight charm to that inconvenience of needing to sort and arrange your inventory, not being able to pick up something straight away and have to sort through and rearrange things and stylize your suitcase. And I think it's such a core component to the overall Resident Evil experience. This isn't a complaint or a critique, but something that I think is more food for thought, as I find that some purists of the original might find this new feature a little jarring and may take away from the experience for some. But one great returning feature from the original game that still remains pretty intact is the return of adaptive difficulty. When I list many of the different things above that I love about Resident Evil 4, and I tick them off this incredible list of things that the original accomplished, I look at how well both versions of the game handle difficulty. When you start your playthrough of Resident Evil 4, there are 3 difficulties that you can pick, and once you do, it cannot be changed. These are easy, normal, and professional. Pretty standard stuff. However, there is another layer of difficulty baked into the game. If you are smashing your way through the game, the difficulty will ramp up, being more strict and scarce with ammo drops and spawning more enemies. However, on the flip side, if you are struggling, the game will be more generous with drops and, you guessed it, spawn fewer enemies. The remake works in a similar way, making enemies deal less damage and being more accommodating if you are struggling with a particular section, and working in reverse if you are blitzing your way through the game. Whilst this may sound like some easy mode cheat, the game never feels like it's shaming you or babying you, and it doesn't ever feel too easy or too hard, and that's another foundational aspect of Resident Evil 4's combat. It provides players with a breadth of tools with a large pool of depth to master and pushes the player to their limits to understand how to effectively utilize these tools. This ultimately makes for a gameplay loop that never feels like it's too easy or unachievable with how challenging it is. It always feels like it's recalibrating and working in a way that subtly is matching your skill as a player and gradually ramping it up to push you and challenge you, but not too much, as different players have different skill levels. But for each player, it will feel like it matches their level of skill and pushes them accordingly. And I think it's a phenomenal way to balance level difficulty. And man, can we just talk about how versatile the sandbox and enemy interactions are. There is a number of ways that each situation can play out. From being able to shoot down lanterns and set your enemies ablaze, to being able to shoot the dynamite that an enemy is holding, blowing them and everything around them into pieces. The world is so reactive. There are so many ways that this world will respond to you given your actions that you take. And this sense of realism is something that was established in the original and is carried over gracefully into the remake. It isn't something that feels gamey, it's more rational with how you can interact with this world. It's something that just clicks into your mind and says, if I do this, will this occur? And it's this cause and effect that you can just play around with and usually plays out. Being able to just even shoot the hand of an enemy and knock the weapon, disarming them, is just a neat little feature. And this is the thing that is just so brilliant about Resident Evil 4, period. Is that there's so many little things in this game that you will discover on multiple playthroughs and new ways to enhance your skill set within playing this game. There's so many little things to get creative with and experiment with, and that is just the beauty of it in a nutshell. The overall combat for Resident Evil 4's remake feels excellent with a variety of ways to defeat your enemies and ways interactions can play out. It really is the mantra of RE4, and it shines through so perfectly here in the remake. The game has so much replay value with many different approaches, weapons, and environmental mastery, as well as the various enemies that you will fight along the way. But not only just the enemies, how they will also interact with the player is another way that only through multiple playthroughs will you fully see. And one thing that I hear many veterans of the original Resident Evil 4 say is to this day they will find new things when playing the game. And that is just a testament to how well this game was made, and how well all the linking components of Resident Evil 4 are, and how brilliant they've encapsulated this in the remake and enhanced it. I think the combat and environmental aspects that I've just discussed are so intelligently crafted just due to how well the environments are and how they have been designed. They still possess many of the blueprints and layouts from the original game, but it's also important to mention that many of these levels and areas have been melded together to make the game feel tighter and more compact. You can explore these areas more freely. The game is still divided into 3 major parts, and each of these parts have an open sort of feeling to them where you can freely explore and backtrack. The game originally would feel somewhat segmented due to its hardware limitations and loading screens, and here in the remake they've taken a lot more creative liberties to trim down some of those linearity to the levels and make it feel more open. Not so much like it's an open world where it's got too much unneeded space, but more freely able to track your way through familiar locations, and it is neatly laid out where you understand where you're going once you've become familiar with a place. On the topic of how well crafted each location is, there is a lot of clever ways, like I mentioned before with sandbox interaction, that even allows you to skip certain parts of the level. For example, the starting point of the game is where you have to have the bell ring and have the enemies go away. Well, they have intelligently crafted some ways to skip these interactions, having, if you understand where to go, you can shoot the bell and skip that segment entirely. And this is what I mean when I say that Resident Evil 4 has so many little hidden details that are baked into it that allow cause and effect for player interaction. Having played Resident Evil 4 and the remake back to back, it is interesting to analyze what components have been removed from this game and what have been added in. Again, it ties into removing the bombastic, campy nature in favor of a more modern and serious survival horror feeling. Some examples of this content that doesn't appear in the remake are moments such as Leon running from the boulder or the statue of Salazar. These cut moments from the game further lend to that more serious thematic approach that Capcom is taking with the game. And frankly, I love these scenes in the original game, and I find them so charming in the context of the original Resident Evil 4. However, I do think the absence of these scenes in the remake does work in the favor of what the remake is trying to accomplish. For this next part, I'm going to be diving into some spoilers as I'll be talking about the boss encounters in Resident Evil 4 and the remake. So if you're still making your way through the game, feel free to just skip ahead to the time on screen now, and you can come back to this once you finish the game, or just skip to the next section. So without further ado, let's get into it. Yeah, the boss encounters in Resident Evil 4, they are incredible. And here in the remake, they still are. They've taken some creative liberties and changed the environments a little bit here mainly, and the encounters still feel, for the most part, the same. There's a few little changes and brush-ups, like how I mentioned earlier with the removal of quick time events. There's no section in like the Delago fight where if you fall out of the boat, like you have to mash a button to get back in. Well, at least I didn't encounter that when doing the encounter twice. Like the schema and skeleton of the encounter stays the same, but for the most part, there is a few changes. But with that being said, a few encounters on the later end of the game have seen some major facelifts and changes. A great example of this is the showdown with Krauser. These refinements and polishes are made to this encounter add additional narrative context that really elevates these fights and makes them a more iconic and dramatic affair than I felt in the original. This can be largely attributed to two different things. Firstly, like I mentioned earlier, the changes and refinements they've made to the story, going for this more serious tone, but secondly, due to the refinements made to the melee mechanics. And this encounter in particular really does put the new refined melee mechanics into action and really pushes you to make sure you understand how parrying works. As this encounter with Krauser, particularly the first one, really does feel like a CQC kind of encounter that you would find in something like Snake Eater. But there's also a narrative punch and impact to this encounter as well, as Krauser is someone who trained Leon and taught him everything he knew. So this kind of showdown is like a master versus teacher, and it really works really well, especially with the new melee combat. One of the best changes to the boss encounters, I feel, is in the second encounter with Krauser, where they really have just reworked that whole encounter. Where in the original game, you would have 3 scattered pieces to unlock a door that was scattered across the fighting arena. And you would go to each location and then you would briefly fight with him, and then in the last area, fight him on the tower. In this game, you move from room to room, but you don't have to collect all 3 of those pieces, and you don't have that little timer at the end, even though that was a cool level of suspense. But they did keep the tower sequence and rework a few things there, and I do feel it is a bit more fitting for what the remake is going for. Overall, I think that these encounters are insane, and I think there's a lot more impact and punch in this one, but I still do love the back and forth of one-liners between Krauser and Leon and them just shit talking while punching and swinging hands. And I will just reiterate this one more time like I have throughout this review. Both games are incredible in their own respects, and it just depends what you're going into and looking for. But here in the remake, they really have nailed the sense of theme and atmosphere that they're going for and they're trying to tell with this iteration of Resident Evil 4. And I consider it just excellent in every single regard.
Over here, stranger.
The final component that I would like to talk about in the Resident Evil loop that neatly seals the package of this god tier experience is the man, the legend, and yes, that is the merchant. Yes, our favorite character from the original is back to ask us the 2 hard-hitting questions. What are we buying and what are we selling? Of course, in this remake, he provides many new features, such as side contracts, which are fun little missions that break up each area and come with their own currency, which you can use to exchange for unique awards. Whilst some of these challenges have been carried over from the original, such as shooting the blue medallions, they are wholly repurposed and streamlined into the gameplay loop, and they feel like they're compartmentalized into new rewards, and they make it feel more fulfilling to accomplish in a way, I guess, and they add more padding into the game. Another new feature that has made its way into this remake is weapon durability for your melee weapons. A few items in the remake will have durability and add another purpose to regularly visit your favorite merchant. There is something so relieving and exciting when you see those purple flames off in the distance. Many different weapons are returning from the original game, and a few new additions have found their way into the remake. The bolt thrower is a new weapon, but also a rework of the mine thrower, and sees a more valuable and versatile approach here in the remake, playing it more stealthy when using the bolts, but you can also splice it with the tool of the original where you attach mines to those bolts and it becomes the original mine thrower. In terms of upgrades to the weapons themselves, they still remain pretty much in the same manner as they were in the original. You will just see some stat upgrades, some ammo increases, reload speed, all those type of variable changes as you purchase new upgrades for your weapons, and there's a new thing that you can unlock in this game called blueprints, where that ties into the crafting system. So as you unlock different types of grenades or ammo for guns, you can craft them and make them on the fly. Overall, I think that these new systems and reworks, especially in the weapons department, really do enhance and justify in a lot of ways this Resident Evil remake. I think that they really do elevate the sandbox. They make it feel like it's a very different experience, whilst still, in a weird way, being the same. And that's one thing I can really say about Resident Evil 4's remake. It's an experience that is overall very familiar, but extremely different. There's a lot of removal of things and changes and tweaks, but it ultimately still feels like the same game that you know and love. It's been refined and reworked to feel like a whole new experience, whilst sustaining a lot of the things that made this original game, that lightning in a bottle, so special to begin with. It's important to note when discussing the sound and visual presentation of Resident Evil 4 just how much work and effort went into the original to capture the sense of realism and immersion that the team were aiming for in the original. This can be found throughout the game, an example being Leon's footsteps, how each individual foot can produce an individual sound based on what Leon is stepping on. Another example is the use of music fading in and out during encounters to create that tense feeling and stressful atmosphere. And whilst many of these things may sound normal now, it's crazy to think because Resident Evil 4 was such an ambitious title in all of the aspects that the team were aiming to create and work on to raise the bar for this game, and in many ways they pioneered a lot of the things that we now consider industry standard. Here in the remake, and now approaching 20 years since the release of the original game, we'd see the adoption of modern technology that would work its way into both the remake's visual and sound presentation. Whilst these additions to the game may not feel as groundbreaking here in the remake as the leaps were back in 2005, I'd argue they are still incredibly impressive. They really do modernize and bring to life many of the different aspects of the Resident Evil 4 experience. The environments here in the remake feel like they're filled with more color, using different color palettes to really articulate a lot of the different areas in the game and pop and bring them to life. There is different lighting effects used here, and animations. A good example of this is how chaotic that introductory scene is where you first arrive at the village. It feels like there is way more enemies here. It feels like there is way more ways that they tackle and grab you. It's insane, and it is wild. Honestly, the amount of new animations as well these enemies have really does keep you on edge. Like the enemies that just run at you and lunge at you with pitchforks, they're actually insane. It is a wild experience, and these enemies caught me off guard a few times. There is also some new enemies here and they look so cool, like the guy with the horse head that runs at you and has the hammer and just like will spin and you have to evade. He's like a crazy heavy, and it's like there is just so much here that they've just kept a lot of charm from the original with these encounters, but they've managed to just add their own little spin on it and make these environments pop in a new way, where you're like, oh, here I am, I'm in this place from the original, but it's a little different, but it's okay. It's still the Resident Evil that you know and love, and I just think there's so much charm to it. It's important to keep this in mind when thinking about Resident Evil 4. When they were developing this game, they were looking to make a game that is isolating, and they were trying to move away from the idea of zombies. They wanted something different, and from the get-go in the remake, you can feel this isolation. You can see it in the fine little tiny details, the bespoke little things hanging on the walls, the dimly lit rooms. Like from that very first instance, like when you go down to the basement at the very start of the game, how there is a lack of lighting and there is little items hanging on the walls, the way that you can inspect the dead animals, like this whole thing, man, it just comes to life. It does everything it can to really enhance the original vision of the Resident Evil 4 experience. It does what they originally set out to do. it brings things to life. It really does just enhance the game. And whilst there is all of that charm that the original still has, I think that the remake has done its own way to really enhance and sustain that level of horror and grit that they were going for, and that feeling of isolation that they wanted to achieve in the original. Both games do it in their own ways, and here with the visual presentation, it's a slam dunk in the Resident Evil remake. If you watch my recent Dead Space review, you would see how I talk about the environmental design of the game, and how I was so in awe of how they really managed to execute the storytelling in that through the environments. I think that a lot of Dead Space's environmental storytelling really did take inspiration from how Resident Evil manages to execute this, and Resident Evil 4 in particular. Resident Evil 4 is a master of the show don't tell tactic, where they do have a lot of items laying around, a lot of files to read, and a lot of environmental aspects that just really paint the picture of what took place there. It allows you to fill in the blanks of what really happened to this village before you arrived and how the things played out. I mean, you will get a conclusive answer to that story, but throughout your journey, just piecing these things together and having that sense of wonder going through this wreck of a once prosperous village really does just put a feather in the cap of how great RE4 is at just telling you a story without actually telling you what happened. And I think that that is another thing that both Resident Evil and Resident Evil Remake execute in spades with their environmental design and their visual presentation. On top of the stunning visual presentation here, there is another thing that they get well in the visual department here in the remake, and that is through the use of visual cues for particular actions. One in particular that I'd like to discuss, and I can't believe I've gone this long without talking about it, is Leon's kick, which will now prompt above enemies' heads instead of the little prompt at the bottom when you stagger an enemy. Here with this little prompt above the enemy's head, you'll be able to run in and swoop in for that kick, roundhouse kicking your enemy and any other enemies that get caught in the crossfire, making it easier for you to space the gap and distance between you and your enemies and feel like a badass in the process. The second core component here is the sound of the Resident Evil remake, which would take advantage of many modern tools, mainly 3D positional audio and sound effects, to create the immersive and tense soundscapes found throughout the remake. I've said this a few times with games that I've covered on this channel, particularly horror games. It's just crazy how many of these games will capture that sense of dread and intensity that shines through its use of sound. And Resident Evil 4 is great at doing this, and it captures this not only through its background music, but also its audio cues and its environmental design and use of sound there from its interactive objects and the stories that carry in these spaces. There were many changes to the animations found in RE4's remake, with the incorporation of motion capture being the biggest departure from the original, and re-recordings of the original dialogue of course, as in RE4's remake they got new actors to take on these roles of these characters and voice and motion capture these characters. I think that all of these actors did a standout job really encapsulating these characters and providing a new light and take on many of our beloved Resident Evil characters. If there's one thing with these characters that I wish I got to see more of, it would be just a bit more time in the sun for Sadler. It feels like he was taken out of this game and given a bit more of an ominous feeling, and I wish that we got a bit more screen time with him like we did in the original. But that's kind of just a minor little thing, and I think that overall all of the acting, both motion capture and voice acting, was an incredible job well done here, and I think that they knocked it out the park and they really captured these characters so perfectly. I know that I've carried on this segment of the review for a bit too long here, but it is one aspect of the game that I do really think was a big undertaking and something that really did encapsulate the charm of the original game, and something that I feel like Capcom have done really well here in the remake in their own respect for the game that they were trying to recreate here. So ultimately, I do think that this part of Resident Evil 4, they really have smashed out the park. In summary, wrapping this review up, the remake of Resident Evil 4 is one of the best remakes I've experienced, and one of the best games I've had the pleasure of playing. There is tons of replay value here, and even on my second playthrough, there were new encounters, mechanics, and tricks to learn to better refine my playstyle. There is something so satisfying about engaging with all the forms of combat that keep you feeling like a badass, but also tense for dear life. There is a perfect balance here, and it feels like that is half of the charm and endless amount of joy that can be had with the Resident Evil experience, and 4 just encapsulates that so perfectly. It's the reason why this game was the lightning in the bottle that it was back in 2005, and Capcom have been able to recapture that here 20 years later with the remake of Resident Evil 4. They've managed to take a game that was already so well made in all of its departments and polish and repackage it in a way that feels both recognizable but completely different. Resident Evil 4, both in its original and remake, is a game that the more you dive into it and replay it, the more you uncover its depths and intricacies. Its narrative elements are more tightly structured, and the characters are given more time to breathe with their character arcs that make them feel more memorable than they already were here in the remake. The artistic reimaginings of many of these iconic locations, the use of lighting, and the diverse use of color palettes makes each of these locations pop to life and creates an incredibly atmospheric experience. The charm of the original game has yet to wear off on its fans, and the remake will carry on the legacy of the original into the future, providing a perfect alternative to what is already a brilliant masterpiece, and a level of confidence and reassurance that the future of the series and its direction are in safe hands. Ultimately, survival horror fan or not, Resident Evil 4 period is a must play, but the remake is definitely a game that I would easily recommend in a heartbeat. It has it all and does it all so perfectly. So if you're on the fence about this series, I would say now is the time, because Resident Evil 4 Remake is a modern masterpiece. Thanks for watching, take care, and if you've made it this far, maybe consider hitting that like and sub. Have a good one.